Thank you, man, and thanks everyone for joining today. As Iman mentioned, this seminar is based on, or this talk is about the work I did during my PhD and is based on my completion seminar. And the focus really, in terms of the human prosthetic interface side of things, is on the upper limb, particularly elbow, for above elbow amputations in those cases. That's where I focused and what we'll be talking about today. But we'll go through all that in a few minutes. So I'll start just laying out what we will talk about. We'll start with what's missing with the current prosthetics, upper limb prosthetics, commercially, and then look at what has people been doing in how people have been doing in the field to try to improve these human prosthetic interfaces. And I'll talk about two particular ones, surface EMG and motion-based interfaces. I'll describe them a bit later. And then I'll focus on motion-based interfaces. Obviously mention why, and we'll look at the challenges of using these sort of motion-based interfaces, human prosthetic interfaces. I'll give a bit of background on online optimization, data-driven optimization, which is the method we went with for solving some of those challenges that I'll mention later. And then particularly we'll go through the contributions. So quite a bit of experimental work. Since we're dealing with humans, there's not a lot that we can simulate. So we'll see a few experiments and how this data-driven personalization was done for a human system. And then we'll talk a bit about, concludes everything and open up a discussion. So let's start with a bit of a video. This person is using probably one of the top, not probably, he's using one of the top elbow and arm prostheses in the market. And basically what I want you to look at is the sort of movements that he is doing with his shoulder and elbow, and try to compare how, what they look like compared to the disabled body arm. If there's anything that pops out.
Ricardo, sorry to interject and interrupt you. There is something wrong with your microphone.
Microphone?
It seems. Yeah.
I might change it. Is that better now?
Yeah, much better.
Okay, good. Yeah, sometimes I have trouble with one of the microphones. Yeah, so hopefully I can play it. Yeah, I'll just move it back. But the whole point is in the movements with that he's doing with his prosthetic arm, if you notice, there is a lack of coordination between the shoulder and the elbow, right? So he mostly keeps one static, and whenever he's moving the prosthetic, is just moving one thing only, right? Focusing on one set of movement. And that is one of the main challenges, particularly with higher levels of amputation, that the prosthetic interfaces don't really allow for coordination. So let's have a look at some of those interfaces to get a better view of this. The traditional one, like the one that has been available and was the top until a couple years ago, was the traditional surface electromyography one. Basically, what this does is a couple of sensors measure the voltage induced by muscle activation, place a couple sensors on major muscle groups, and that's what the person uses to drive the motors of the prosthesis. Activates one side of the forearm, and that drives the hand to close, drives it in the opposite direction, drives the hand to open. And it's exactly the same depending, if you go for biceps and tricep, bicep will do, movement in one direction or the other for the elbow or the hand or the wrist. So you can imagine that if you're, doing bicep curls to closing your hand, it's not very intuitive. Then people, obviously started looking at things like pattern recognition and some regression, pattern recognition combined. to try to alleviate some of these problems, right? Particularly in the forearm, this is a method that has worked really well, because instead of having just 2 sensors, they place an array of sensors and then try to extract the patterns from all the muscles within the forearm. And that has worked particularly well for those level of amputations. The forearm has a lot of muscles in it, so it's quite easy to extract, particular patterns like making a fist or moving your wrist like this. So that has worked really well. But the problem goes that when you go to higher amputations, then you lose all those signals, right? Because they're based on the muscles. So on your upper arm, you have biceps, which drive the elbow only. So again, we have the same problem. Some people have looked into surgical procedures, so taking the nerves out, they debundle the nerve, they put it into other muscles like in the chest, and then have multiple sites that would have, related to muscles in the forearm and so on. And that way, then people have been able to use, again, this machine learning based methods to try to estimate what the person is trying to do. And they've had various degrees of success, but the problem is that not everyone is suitable for these types of surgeries or willing to go through it. And that's why people have looked at motion-based interfaces. And the difference here is that instead of using just using the EMG sensor, people add motion sensors to the arm. And basically what you're doing with this interface is couple the movement of the prosthetic with that of the residual limb or the stump. Yeah, so if I move my shoulder up, and there's some linear or non-linear coupling between the prosthetic movement and my shoulder movement, it will extend the elbow, which is sort of what you're seeing in that video. And people have looked at it in different approaches, methods, linear coupling. Some people obviously have looked at machine learning methods, using neural networks or this sort of stuff. But people haven't really looked at personalization. So in the other ones, the other methods, the clinician would tune the sensors so the person can use the interface effectively. And then the machine learning method then just, with an app, they tell people do a fist, and then the person does the fist, and then they retrain their algorithms that way. But this has not been done or in motion-based interfaces so far. I'll explain why it's sort of a bit of a challenge. So this figure shows the shoulder velocity for sort of a reaching motion for 6 different able-bodied people. The way that normally you would train one of these motion-based interfaces, you grab a group of able-bodied people and you ask them to do a task, for example, some reaching movements. You collect data from the what would be the stump of the residual limb, which is the upper arm, and then also from the elbow, from the forearm too, which is what the interface, the human-prosthetic interface, will be estimating. In this case, the motion-based interface will be estimating. So what is the elbow doing? And then they train the neural network or whatever algorithm to estimate, what this elbow angle should be from all the shoulder or velocities. And what you would end up getting is sort of the mean out of all these, right? So you have a group of people, and the resulting estimation would be something along those lines. Now the problem happens, that we have this wide variation in motor behavior among people. So if you land somewhere on the mean, like this, let me get my pointer. Why can I see the annotate? Oh, okay, never mind.
Go to top of the screen. There is a view options. Click on that.
Yeah, I cannot see the annotate ones. That's the problem.
Oh, okay.
I normally can see it, but I cannot see it. Well, anyway. Well, hopefully you can see the one that it's a bit purple. And so that one would work really nice, right? It's pretty much being overlapped by the mean. But if you were to use one of like the sky blue one, then your estimation would be a bit off, right? So that is one of the main challenges, and people, and since you're training these systems with able-bodied people, now why can you do it with a person with limb difference, an amputee or prosthetic user? They no longer have that part of the limb, right? So it'd be very difficult to get them to do the movements that you require to train the system. And the other one is what we call here synergy training dependency. So this, when you're training the interface, in this called the synergy, the coupling between the prosthetic and the residual limb, there is a dependency obviously with the task. So if you're reaching for a bunch of different targets and you're starting from the same position, whenever you want to do your estimations, you're limited to that, task space. So if you wanted to have multiple tasks like reaching sideways and all these sort of things, then you would need to train different sort of interfaces for this task. Today, I'll focus on the first one, addressing the personalization issue rather than the dependency on task. But I do have some work on the second one as well. All right, I'll introduce the experimental setup first, just to give you an idea of how all these experiments and everything were done. I opted for using virtual reality, mainly because we can virtually amputate people. I used to say throughout my PhD that I was virtually amputating people for science. The idea is that if you place a motion sensor, on the upper arm, and just use that within the virtual world, then you can show the person only that part and a prosthetic, or replace it virtually. So it allows to test both able-bodied people with and without prosthesis, and people with limb difference wearing the prosthesis, which made it quite interesting. Sort of look like this. If I was doing a reaching forward in an able-bodied setting, that's what it would look like. And with the prosthesis, if you can see now, the elbow is some shape in virtual reality. So that's how the experiment was done. Okay, so let's get into now the whole idea of using data-driven optimization to do this personalization of the interface. Now, the whole idea is that if we get the person to, repeat a task, so we give them do 8 tasks, like reaching to target, and then we measure the performance of them doing that task. For instance, I'll use mostly for the half of the talk, I'll use this target error plus completion time as a measure of performance, but you have some measure of performance for that task. And the idea is that by doing this repeatedly, then we can estimate the direction of what the optimal interface parameter would be. In this case, I'm calling theta, the synergy parameter. And then we can update into the direction of that optimal parameter for this person. And we opted to go with extreme seeking, the method of extreme seeking. Now, for us to be able to use extreme seeking in one of the systems, then we need to make sure that we satisfy some conditions for this algorithm, particularly on that relationship between the interface parameter and the measure of performance. And these are those conditions. So first one is that there is an optimum, that exists an optimum. So basically, for a range of parameters, there is a single parameter that maximizes performance. That is the case in a region of interest, so it's locally convex. And then the last one is that the system is, or this map, this relationship between the parameter and performance is static. So if we repeat the task over and over again, this sort of relationship, this map, does not change. Now the big question is, does a human prosthetic system, does a human even satisfy these conditions? The only way to test this is experimentally. And that's why I introduced that the experimental setting. And the way that we tested is we set up a very basic synergy, just a linear relationship, linear coupling between the shoulder velocity and the elbow velocity. We used target error plus completion time, well, a function of that as the measure of performance. And we got people to use the prosthetic device enough so they learned how to use it and they had an idea of what they're supposed to do. And one of the key things is that we had to present this measure of performance to people as a score, just so they know what they're being evaluated on, right? You don't want to say like, oh, I just reached a target, and they may be thinking, oh, I need to do it really quick, or I need to do it slowly and accurate. So presenting this measure of performance was really important to get people to know what they're evaluating on and what their objective is. And these are the results from that experiment. So we did a sweep of all these parameters, and these are two different people. And even though we obviously have a lot of variations, there's a variation in the measurements. This is expected from people. But this is as good as it gets with getting this sort of relationship in humans. So it's really, we got that shape that we want. There seems to be, on average, an optimal value that an optimal value that maximizes performance, and they're quite different, like both the maps and the values between the two individuals. So these were really exciting results to see early on. This was published in these two papers if you are interested. And all right, so knowing that we satisfied the condition of the map, then we can apply the extreme-seeking algorithm to a person. So this is showing just a bit of the structure look like and what we did. And this is applying that extreme-seeking on one person doing the reaching task. So they're repeating the task over and over again. And at the same time, the extreme-seeking algorithm is looking for that optimal synergy value or interface, prosthetic interface parameter. And the results were pretty good, all things considered, from human system. Now, the reality is a bit more nuisance, as you would expect from humans. When you're doing this whole these experiments and you consider human learning, the reality is a map that looks a bit like this. You have one parameter, the person repeats the task multiple times, and you start to populate the map sort of like that. And if we were to zoom into two of those values, this is what we would see. So there is some transient in the improvement of performance, as we would expect from human learning. So they're learning how to use the device and everything. Then it settles down, reaches to some steady state. This is very common with people doing motor task. It's very common to see this sort of like transient and then steady state. It's widely reported. Now, the thing is that when we change the synergy, when we change the value, this sort of like restarts learning. We're changing the dynamics of the system and changing how the prosthetic responds. So there is sort of like a relearning that needs to happen. Yeah. So in this case, we no longer satisfy this sort of static condition, right? there are some dynamics in our system, and that can impact the applicability of this particular extreme seeking algorithm, and it can impact quite severely the performance. So we have now two different people, subject A and subject B. Subject A is the one that I showed you before. The algorithm was tuned for this person, works fairly well. We put it with someone who has completely different sort of learning characteristics and motor behavior characteristics, and the algorithm just didn't converge, didn't work, which is it's a bit of a challenge. Now, obviously, there are ways that we can handle dynamical systems with extreme seeking. One is thinking about timescale separation, where we either wait for the steady state or we tune the algorithm for each particular person to address the differences in learning dynamics. Now, why wouldn't we want to do this? If we're waiting for the steady state, let's say that the human takes about 60 repetitions to get to the steady state, and the algorithm needs about 40 different parameters to test different parameters before converging. That it's about 2,400 trials, which means that you would have the person repeating the task, this bridging motion for 3 hours, which is not very fun to do, to put it mildly. And then you also have the issue that if you wanted to target a bunch of different tasks, then this is completely out of the question. Especially when you have a clinical setting and you just have 30 minutes to 1 hour to do some of these things, right? So that is out of the question. Now, individual tuning, it's not that straightforward to tune these algorithms. And we would need to know a person's learning dynamics beforehand, which is not that easy. Same, it will require running some tests and all this. And we cannot expect a clinician, because in the end, this would be intended for a clinician, to be able to tune these parameters and everything. Right? So not really something that we can practically do. So what can we do instead? Well, we can take advantage of what we learned from these previous experiments in terms of what we see people do. And these are examples, but we observe it in the the group of people that we tested with. Is that you have that sort of static convex map once people have learned the task and they've done this sufficiently. And you have that sort of like LTI system dynamics, on average, you have that learning dynamics, which are very surprisingly, they're fairly regular. So we can take advantage of this knowledge and then choose, an algorithm appropriately. So as I mentioned, we can model this particular behavior as a combination of a nonlinear map and an LTI system, and this sort of models the entire mapping from the prosthesis interface parameter theta to the measure of performance. So we have all the kinematics and measure of performance, objective function, and human motor learning happening there. And lucky for us, there is a type of extreme seeking algorithm, fast extreme seeking, which is suitable for this type of system. The whole idea, well, the algorithm in general, the entire system would look something like that. So there are some differences with extreme seeking, but the main point is that it allows us to take advantage of our knowledge of the relative degree of the learning dynamics, or the shape of the learning dynamics, without having to know particular parameters for each person, right? So we only need to know what sort of shape this LTI system has, what's the relative degree of the LTI system, and then we can design our algorithm which is a big step up. And the whole idea is that this will speed up significantly the convergence of the algorithm, that we won't need to wait for the person to reach steady state or tune it individually. I can talk a lot about how this sort of thing works, but it's probably a good point to show you a video of how this works. For this example, I'm showing lean angle as a measure of performance, just because it's easier to show in a video. But in the experiments that will follow, we kept using the same accuracy, completion time measure of performance. The whole idea is that the person repeats the task, the algorithm will modify the parameter, and we'll have that sort of improvement in the measure of performance. Now, there's still some lean angle because of the distance for that target, but that is the idea. Okay, and these are the results for the algorithm. This fast extreme seeking algorithm running on 6 different subjects. Don't mind the letters because I just crop it from a larger data set. But the whole idea is that we have 6 different people, same algorithm, and we get the convergence within the 150 iterations. Now, this translated into more prosthetic related terms. So if we have 150 iterations, that means that it would take us about 12.5 minutes to do the personalization of this interface, which is 15 times faster than the previous one, which is quite a big jump. It's quite a significant reduction. So this makes it quite feasible to actually happen within a clinical setting. You could target different tasks, not just one single reaching motion, and it's only one tuning for all these people. So you just need to tune the algorithm once. The clinician would not be involved in tuning this algorithm at all. So pretty exciting results. And yeah, so that was published in Transactional Cybernetics. If you're interested to have a look at a bit more detail. Now looking at a bit into more of not just what the algorithm did, but what happened with what the person is doing. On the left, we have the non-personalized. In A, we have the hand path on the sagittal plane. And then on B, we have the forward displacement. Sorry, this is not the sagittal plane, it's a top view. And then V is time and the forward displacement. And then on the right, we have the personalized. And overall, we can see that, yes, accuracy was improved, and obviously was quicker to perform the task. But also we see a very big change in the variance of the path, which is actually quite interesting. As we it's closer to what able-bodied people would do. Some of the interesting sort of highlights on the side. If you see the person on the left sitting on the chair, when if they didn't have the elbow brace and the sort of the setting didn't quite match, they were doing really weird things with their elbows, sort of like as if they would extend their actual elbow more, it would extend the prosthetic in virtual reality, which made it quite interesting. But more interestingly is that when the prosthetic was personalized to them, so the setting was better set for them specifically after the personalization process, they would actually track the actual virtual hand really well with their hand, which I found quite fascinating from a just observation point of view. All right, cool. So we've been talking about this whole thing, from that measure of performance, that we're showing these people, some score and everything. And this is the objective of this was saying like, person has this objective, which is the same as the prosthetic, and they should come to the same conclusion. You would expect them to have the same conclusion. And we've been doing our personalization with this in mind, right? But again, with people, the reality is a bit more complicated. And the reality is that the human has this measure of performance, this internal measure of performance, and we have some measure of performance with the prosthetic that we design. And the way that we made this work and made them as close together as possible, it was by showing that score. Now, in general, it is widely agreed that we optimize some form of task and some measure of the task and some measure of our effort to do things from multiple perspectives, physical, cognitive, and so on. And we approached it from the task perspective. So try to optimize for the task by showing you this score that you need to work towards. But if we think about it, if we go outside of virtual reality, how can you show that to a person, when they're using an actual prosthesis? And the other one is, how do you measure that, performance of a task if, if maybe you don't know what the task is? So that that could be a bit of a challenge, and it stops being practical outside of VR. So what about effort? Could we use effort instead? And my idea with this, when I started thinking about this, is that if the person already subconsciously knows the measure of performance, and we on our design side, from we design our objective function for the prosthetic, we approach it enough, then you don't need to tell the person this is what you're optimizing towards. It's inherent in our behavior. Now, what should we use as that measure of performance, right? Like, there are a lot of different theories of what we optimize internally. I'm not sure we'll ever know exactly how we do it. And that's why I opted for the more sort of like clinical, practical side of things, which is compensation motion. And if you think about it, it's fairly it made sense to me. If you cannot reach enough, you will lean forward. And a lot of clinical studies in prosthetics use this as a measure of how well a prosthetic is assisting the person in performing a motion. So that's what we did. So instead, we had this physical, like hardware application, so a supernumerary elbow attached to the person with a couple IMUs, so to measure the compensation, the trunk and the shoulder, and we got them to do a similar sort of task, like point to a circle on a screen. And the idea is that we want to develop this sort of measure of performance that is based on compensation motion, which sort of relates to our effort when doing things. And again, we need to test whether this measure of performance that we are designing satisfies some of these conditions. And the first thing that we wanted to do is, how does the compensation motion and the forward displacement relate to the parameter of the Human-Prosthetic Interface? And the most interesting, or the main thing that we saw here, and that made it quite interesting for us and promising, is that let me explain these plots before I go ahead, getting carried away. So what we have is the x-axis, that interface parameter, and then forward displacement in the y-axis, and the blue one representing trunk displacement, so leaning with the trunk forward, and shoulder displacement in the orangey one, which is doing this sort of motion, like rotating the shoulder forward. And the difference between the dots and the circles and the lines represent what people did on average with their able-bodied. So getting them to do the task with their actual arm, what sort of displacement do they have, and then the circles are doing that sweep with the supernumerary elbow, so that sort of prosthetic elbow. And what we can see here, again, all things considered, they're humans, there's a fair bit of variation, is that if we were to do sort of like the linear regression, or draw a line in the experimental data for the prosthesis, we would find this intersection with the able-bodied behavior. And intuitively, what this tells me is that there is a synergy value or parameter value that would achieve this sort of like able-bodied behavior, which is quite promising. Like we're saying, oh, then if I can design a measure of performance with this in mind, then we might be able to get pretty close to what this person will be doing with their able-bodied arm. So we designed that measure of performance using these two metrics, the trunk and shoulder displacement. And we get this map between that new measure of performance, which, since we are now trying to minimize the compensation, because that's sort of what we tend to do, now we'll just call it a cost. So we have that cost, and we do see that even though it's a bit flat in some parts, on average we get that sort of convex behavior or concave behavior that we would like. Cool. All right. So then we tried it out on people, and these are tuned the algorithm a little bit just because of the change of the cost function, but largely remains the same. And we run the experiments, like the personalization experiments, getting them to repeat the task while the personalization algorithm, the fast extreme seeking algorithm, is running. And these are 3 sort of highlight people out of all the people that we run this experiment with. A is sort of like your ideal human being, the high achiever who always does really well. And if we see how the algorithm behave really well in terms of the cost function being reduced, minimized, and then the synergy value converging quite fairly quickly and staying in a fairly constant value. On the other hand, we have B, and the main thing that we can see here is around these iterations. What happened here is that around 40, at the 40th iteration, we gave them a bit of rest time so they wouldn't get fatigued, and then we resumed the experiment. And I assumed that this person sort of forgot what they were doing, and we saw that sort of jump in the cost, and person is sort of relearning, like, oh yeah, I was doing this, and it sort of goes down again to what it was before. And this obviously affected the performance of the algorithm because we would be expecting a specific gradient, but then that discontinuity, that big jump, caused trouble there. And then we have C. So C, I think, is that sort of person that has sudden realizations, like have epiphanies. It's like, oh, this is not working, I'm just doing the same thing, and then suddenly, oh, what happened here? This is this is better, it's more comfortable, and we see that big jump in the cost. And this will make a lot more sense. Like, why am I saying this? I'll make more sense in the next slide when we look at displacement. So this is those individual terms in terms of displacement. So what is the person doing as the algorithm progresses in the personalization and gets closer to what the best value would be for a particular person. So for A, we see that the trunk displacement keeps going down and down, mostly going down, and that's how we see that very typical response of the extreme seeking algorithm. And interestingly, the shoulder remained quite constant. So there was not a big change, even though that when we designed the cost function, we asked it to minimize it to 0. So we said like the set point is 0, which was unexpected. I was expecting that they would also reduce that, but it seems like that maintaining that sort of like 5 centimeters of forward displacement with the shoulder was more comfortable. Now B, so this is what I mean when I say they sort of forgot what they were doing. When after the rest time, this person started leaning forward again. So there was no change in the setting or anything in the prosthesis, except for what the algorithm was doing, and that's what caused the algorithm to go to another set point to diverge, and then eventually kind of got back, but since it was quite not really the best for this person because of what diverges this cost, this sort of discontinuity cost. No, he was performing very with a lot of variation. So something that when we think about humans in a practical setting, and we want to use an algorithm like this needs to be addressed somehow, because we cannot expect humans to perform like subject A 100% of the time. And then C, on the other hand, as I mentioned, they sort of have like, they're doing exactly the same thing for 35 iterations or so, and suddenly they kind of realized it had a bit of a less shoulder movement, and probably realized that if they lifted their arm more, they extended their arm more, then the prosthetic would extend more, and then suddenly big jump, reduce the displacement, and again have some problems for the algorithm to actually find what the best setting for this person is. Okay, so probably better to put it in perspective just to wrap up. This is what it would look like before the personalization. So the first few iterations, quite a lot of leaning forward. And after the personalization, that the algorithm, when it works well, and it finds that best setting for this person, then we get this sort of like more natural pose, or reaching to the screen. And to highlight again, we didn't tell the person what the measure of performance was at all. We just told them you have this arm and you need to touch with the end of the arm that point in the screen. And the personalization algorithm was operating on this compensation motion based measure of performance. So to me, this is a big thing, because then this means that we don't need to tell like the person what the measure of performance if we use something that is relatively close to what the person would be inherently or implicitly optimizing. It's a bit of difficult to say what is close enough or what it's the person optimizing internally, but with what we know of human behavior, it can help us design these types of algorithms, which I thought was a pretty awesome outcome of my PhD. All right, just to summarize, we had a look a bit of how people have different motor behavior and this drive that need for personalization in human prosthetic interfaces. And then our knowledge of this sort of human behavior and mentally, all these theories that people have studied before, allowed us to design this data-driven personalization algorithm that can be applied to people that are learning to do a motor task. In this case, with a prosthetic, they're learning how to use a prosthetic, and you can do the personalization at the same time, which makes this type of procedure feasible within a clinical setting. And these photos are just photos of a bunch of the people that did my experiment, just so you see that I didn't just do it with 20-odd-year-old males from the engineering department. So we also have female colleagues in engineering, and one of our colleagues was also kind enough to invite his parents to do the experiment. So we got a bit of a variation in terms of humans. And just to wrap up, what we talked about at the end, that compensation motion was quite a successful measure of performance that doesn't need to be provided to the person for this particular case. And for me, it motivates looking at beyond prosthetics, whether there's any interplay between human and autonomous system, where you don't need to make this sort of measures of performance explicit. But yeah, that's more of a sort of like an idea interest in terms of research that it's not part of my PhD. Anyway, so that is it. Thank you all for listening, and I guess we can open it for questions.
Thanks, Ricardo. Is there any question for Ricardo? Okay.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Ricardo. It was a great presentation. Very interesting and very well presented.
Thank you.
Just maybe to clarify the synergy parameter, like on the current slide, it's around 1.5. Is this a joint angle ratio, or?
Yeah, so in this one is velocity. So it's a scaling, like a linear scaling with the shoulder, like this upper arm angular velocity and the elbow velocity.
Okay.
Yeah.
So from what I could see in these experiments, you're doing repeatedly the same task, and you're kind of doing the extremum seeking over this synergy parameter, right?
Yeah.
I wonder if you've looked at cases where, I mean, of course, having a large variety of tasks is very difficult, but if you had reaching, but the object you're reaching for moves side to side, up or down, forward or back a little bit, so it's kind of different distances and angles, whether there are kind of consistent synergies that occur between shoulder and elbow, or whether you would also need to know the intended reaching position to be able to have the right synergy. I mean, perhaps there's some kind of mapping from goal location to the synergy angle or something. Have you looked at that?
Yeah, I didn't look at it personally, but there is some work on this in the whole sense of learning about synergies that occur in reaching, and people have been able to estimate from measurements of position, angular position, and angular velocity. So 6 degrees of freedom, the IMU position and velocities, angular velocities, to estimate reaching from a single start position to I think it's so sort of, it's not, I think it's on a plane in front.
Right.
Yeah. So it is really limited by the information that you can get from the IMU sensors, I suppose.
And I guess another question, so you have this kind of the oscillation to converge.
Yeah.
Do you think if this kind of system is used, if somebody is wearing a prosthetic, do you think you would run that for a little while and then freeze the synergy values, or would you just let it kind of keep running with a small dither and maybe it changes slowly over time?
So we haven't really looked at long term. So this was within one session, an hour or less, of 15, 20 minutes. Practically speaking, I would say that you would, stop it at that point, just because you wouldn't want it to change or something happens. Like what happened with the people that, sort of have like a different behavior, some sudden changes. You wouldn't want that to happen while the person is actually using the prosthetic rather than doing the personalization task.
So mainly for safety reasons, I guess.
Yeah. So from a practical perspective, but if all these sort of like different sort of like nonlinear behaviors that humans observe are addressed, and people have looked at how these synergies change over time, and it is a thing, right? Like as you learn a motor task, you change the way that you perform the task until you find that optimal, and that occurs over long periods of time. If you're playing soccer and you're learning to kick the ball, over many years it changes, right? So I would expect that this sort of occurs with these systems. One way could be, you do this every year or something, but if you address all this, sort of like weird behaviors, then you could leave it on with a small dether or something. So yeah.
Great.
As I know. Yep.
Thanks, Ricardo. Michael has a question for you. Do you want to, Michael?
Yeah, thanks, Ricardo. I just had a question about the time scale separation that usually is in place for extreme seeking type approaches to work. So usually it's the process is meant to be the faster time scale, right? So it reaches a steady state, and then you do the updates of with the extreme seeking. So it's not clear here how much of a timescale separation there is, given that you're repeating the task. So can you shed any light on how that works here?
I guess
like the learning would be slow, I'd imagine, right? The human's loop is not fast.
Let me so I'll just share my slides again.
Well, you had the nice picture, right, where you had both loops
yes,
shown,
I'm just gonna get back to that one quickly. This one, right? Why is it not changing? That one.
Oh, but just even looking at the two loops, right? You had a picture with the two loops, right? You had the what the algorithm's doing. Yep, there you go. Yeah. So that top loop, right, is what the brain's doing, right?
Yeah, so that's what the person is doing, and this should be if we were to do the timescale separation, this is the fast loop, right?
Yeah, but so that's what I'm not clear in my head, how that can be fast compared to what you're doing on the bottom.
It's because of human learning. So
every repetition it's faster.
So the extreme seeking is happening over iterations of the task, not within one iteration.
But does learning reach a steady state? Do you learn a new steady state just by repeating the action once? That's, I guess,
no. So sorry, but do you mean from the human perspective? So
yeah, I guess when you're repeating the task, right?
Yeah.
Do you update? Does the extreme seeking loop at the bottom update the parameter for every repetition of the task?
Yes.
And so the assumption would be that after each repetition, the human has already learned how to move with the new parameter in one iteration.
Yeah. So the change would have to be if we were just doing timescale separation, it would have to be very slow, right? So because otherwise it happens what this in this figure on the right, that if the jump is big enough, they need to relearn it, and that takes several iterations. When the change is really small, it's sort of like, and the whole idea with using fast extreme seeking is to not need to do that. So the fast extreme seeking option allows us to sort of invert the learning dynamics. such that we can update at the same time as the human is learning to do the task.
Right, but if you just kept the parameter fixed
mm-hmm.
and got the human to repeat the thing multiple times, there would be an improvement in the cost just without changing the parameter, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Yes, so it's not clear that just after one repetition that they've already learned how to respond to the new parameter, right? It hasn't reached a new steady state for that new value of the parameter after just one repetition.
No.
So I was just wondering whether they do multiple repetitions and then you adjust the parameter, or whether it's every one.
Oh yeah, no. So it was actually running at the same time. So in every iteration there will be an update, and I didn't have the parameters, but I don't know if we can see it in one of the plots. But the change was relatively small in each one of those iterations. Like if the dither was too large, or the update was too fast, it would cause problems for people trying to do this. Yeah, so it still needs to be relatively slow in the update.
Right. Okay. Yeah, thanks.
Yep. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. And we are out of time. So if you have any further questions, comments, you can just contact Ricardo. Maybe you can continue this discussion.
Yep.
Thanks, everyone. See you next week.
Thank you, everyone.